Thanks everyone for joining us. If this is the first time you're tuning in, I'm Max, one of the founders here at World Forum Disrupt. World Forum Disrupt is primarily a business events company focusing on facilitating thought-provoking and innovative conversations around a number of different business areas, one of which, of course, is software development. We're always very excited to be able to bring free content to our audience, but of course that wouldn't be possible without the support of our partners. So I just want to quickly take this opportunity to thank DevGraph for their help in creating this webinar. For any of you guys who aren't familiar with DevGraph software, then be sure to check them out. And if you're keen to talk to anyone from DevGraph, then be sure to drop your email in the chat and one of their team will reach out. So we've got an awesome webinar for you today. We're joined by our fantastic panel of speakers who will be using the hour to take a deeper look at the development of NoOps. So please do ask any questions you have throughout the webinar. If you just use the chat function or the Q&A function to submit any questions, and then our panelists will try and get to these at the end of the conversation. So without further ado, I just want to introduce you to James Rutt, who is the Chief Information Officer at Dana Foundation. James will be wearing a couple of hats for us today. He'll be moderating the session, but he'll also be joining in on the conversation, providing his insight as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, James.
Well, thank you, Max, and thanks again, World Forum Disrupt, for having me for a third time moderating one of your panels. It's been wonderful the first two times. I don't expect it to be any different this time. We've got a great panel and we've got a great topic. As Max stated, the topic is NoOps. And before we get into introductions, I wanted to lay out a couple line items to kind of set the stage for the discussion. I'm particularly interested from our audience as to your views around NoOps and how that term has kind of come into the vernacular as of late. So the way that Forrester describes NoOps is the goal of completely automating the deployment, monitoring, and management of applications and the infrastructure on which they run. Now, adjacent to that, that piece is where they think their NoOps or the concept of NoOps is going. And they see that although some operations positions will become unnecessary, others will simply evolve from a purely technical perspective to one that's more business related. So I'm trying to set the stage here for the conversation today, and I think we're going to get some great input from our panelists. And I'm also excited to hear any questions that we see from the audience to that effect. With that, I'd like to ask our panelists to please introduce themselves. Raul, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, James. So I'm Rahul Subramaniam. I'm the CEO at Dev Factory, which is the R&D arm of a private equity firm called ESW Capital. We are in the business of buying and turning around enterprise software companies. We are currently a group of about 140 plus enterprise software companies in the portfolio. And over the last decade and a half, we've been working on a lot of tools and solutions to manage our own development at scale, with thousands of developers working in 120 different countries. And so we are now bringing some of those products to market under a portfolio that we call DevGraph, or under a suite of products called DevGraph. So do feel free to check it out. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Mark, if you would, please.
Yes, my name is Mark Hahn, and I am Director of DevOps for Cyber Global. We're a subsidiary of HTC Services, Inc., and we're both, the companies are consultants. We help companies build software that power their business. In my role as strategy for cloud and DevOps, I'm responsible for all things related to software velocity for my company. So I help our consulting teams that are working with our business clients to develop software both reliably and efficiently, but as quickly as possible. And we use a variety of different tools for that. And we use a variety of each client that we work with has got different biases and different tools they want to work with. So my job is to maintain parity in the processes on top of multivariate tool sets. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, that's a great start. I foresee the conversation going about 40 minutes, and then we'll leave time for any Q&A from the attendees here today. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and let's get started. The first question I'm going to pose to you, Mark. What are from your view, what are the core differences and dependencies between the DevOps and the NoOps approach in your mind?
So the differences have a lot to do with really shifting left more on all of the processes. With DevOps, development teams still can rely on, or still have to rely on, various operations and infrastructure support teams to do a lot of the work. With NoOps, the goal is to make those teams fully self-sufficient, so that everything that they need, they've got within their grasp. And so in that you've got a few developers that have to manage a large variety of different requirements, and so automation becomes a key to that. But the automation is built to empower the humans so they can focus on the things that are important about operating the system. One of the things that we do at Cyber Global is remember that a key point of running a business system is to extract the business value out of it. So we're always looking for ways to make that business value more observable and more transparent to both the development teams as well as to the business users, so that the development teams and business teams are on the same page. To do that, again, you need a process that allows the teams to be empowered. So a lot of your traditional operation processes, such as creating tickets to get work done, those have to be turned into things that can be just automated, as we see in cloud environments using infrastructure as code. So those are, so those tools that support infrastructure as code, tools that give visibility, tools that automate deployments and the continuous delivery process are the sorts of things that become dependencies in supporting a NoOps environment.
Yeah, I think it's great to point out a couple of things that you mentioned. One, this idea of shifting left, I see it not only from an infrastructure perspective, but any supporting functionalities within these architectures. So, in terms of security or app dev security, I'm wondering how that could help as well, because you have less of a human impact within the value stream that you have to worry about, and then less dependency on those folks to worry about the intricacies of protecting the code at the front end, so to speak, or at the back end upon release. And you're kind of shrinking down the window of opportunity for errors from one perspective. The other thing is, I like the way you've kind of framed the difference there from a human resource perspective. When we're talking about automation, I think, there's two different views on it depending on what function we come from. So from a technology perspective, we're looking really more for efficiency and to reduce error flow. Whereas from a business side, sometimes the lens is a little more tainted, where they see automation as an opportunity to purely cut costs, most likely in the human realm. So the way I think in reality, I don't think there's much opportunity or there's much appetite, I should say, for looking at it as strictly something to tear down the team, so that's great. Rahul, would you like to add on? And also, I'm also wondering about prime motivations for exploring such a strategy, NoOps as opposed to DevOps. Yeah.
So if you really look at how DevOps came about, it was the transformation of infrastructure itself as API. So earlier you had hardware and then you had software, which are two completely distinct, pieces of operation. As API driven, today most infrastructure, whether it's your storage, your compute, or any other third-party service that you use.
Rahul, I think you're breaking up quite a bit. Maybe you want to go off video to save bandwidth.
Is this getting any better?
Much better, much better.
Yeah, great. So what I was saying was, as a lot of your dependent infrastructure is turning into API, especially with the cloud and with virtualization, even, with VMware, it's kind of turned into an API-driven setup. That kind of led to the fact that to now deploy your code, you needed to extend your code into API and plug into that infrastructure. And that's how DevOps kind of came about. In my view, the NoOps approach has another dimension to it beyond just automation. And that is that today we have far too many choices to make, and making the right kind of choice is extraordinarily hard. You just have so much choice on today. When you take a basic application, let's say you build a Spring Boot application and you wanted to deploy it, the number of choices you need to make about how to go deploy it into a production environment, the number of decisions you have to make are crazy. They're about 10x what it was even 5 or 8 years ago. And that has caused the DevOps function to get far more complicated, because you not only need to worry about the automation, but you also need to worry about the choices you make and in the tool sets that you're going to use for infrastructure and the automation. And that gets really hard. So for me, NoOps is also an approach where you get some stuff right out of the box that you can leverage to go deploy your app, where your dev teams get to focus primarily on the code and the core business function, while the deployment mechanism is taken care of for you without you having to make a massive number of choices. So for me, NoOps has an extra dimension of practicality, which is, let me not get into this analysis paralysis of what the ideal deployment scenario is. And today, in reality, a lot of infrastructure gets over-architected, just like code invariably gets over-architected, for the function you need it to go perform. So NoOps is kind of the mechanism by which you say, here's your framework. All these choices are already made for you. If this works for you, just drop in your code and it should just work for you. So the automation kind of builds in to how you get your delivery done without having to worry about the underlying mechanics.
That's an interesting juxtaposition. The other thing that came to mind as we're listening to some of these responses, don't you think that there's a broad assumption when we're talking about already, we're almost putting the cart before the horse in a way, and I'll explain why. I think there's a broad assumption that DevOps is completely 100% mature. It's accomplished everything that it's wanted to so far. Whereas in most of the shops, at least the ones that I talk to, they feel mature from a certain areas of the value stream, but not 100%, when it comes to synchronization of all the tools that enable that, the DevOps functionality. And now we're talking about making another quantum leap into, NoOps, however we wish to define the benefits from that. Do you think that we're kind of jumping way too quickly ahead and not really, figuring out is DevOps, should it be completely torn down for this new paradigm?
Well, I don't think that I think DevOps is, you've got a scale from highly operational teams that segregate into silos and follow, say, a strict ITSM protocol, to teams that can do DevOps. And so there's this, you've got an ability, or development teams should take a look at this spectrum and go, where on this spectrum do we see we're most comfortable with, and how do we implement it? A lot of fast moving development teams are going to want to move to DevOps because they can control more of their own destiny. And the only blockers they've got in the road path are their own blockers. And DevOps is a way to move from a heavy ticket-based, separate siloed operational organization into something where you can control this stuff and move at the pace that makes sense for the software and the business value that you're trying to deliver. So I think it's really a spectrum of choices now that you've got. And I see that the move across DevOps, NoOps is what I think of as the true north of a move into DevOps. But not all organizations are mature enough or ready enough or comfortable enough to get to a place where they're going to let developers make a lot of choices on their own. So you'll see that they're, that's where older processes, fall into place, because they want someone to have a second set of eyes on what a dev team is doing. Dev teams that are fully DevOps enabled will often, they've already built lots of checks and balances, lots of second eyes into their systems. in the systems that I developed over time, one of the key things that we developed before we released software into production was always to build some kind of a reconciliation or a cross-check or some other kind of process that allowed me to make sure that the data that is being operated on is correct, so that I know that I can move forward comfortably with delivering the system. That checks and balance is something that we took on as our own responsibility, rather than letting that be the responsibility of an operations team or a compliance team or a security team. We internalized that and got to NoOps in that route.
It's an interesting thing. So I think to myself, is the end game of NoOps to be where everything is automated and the only human interaction is to do the checks and balances at the end of the pipeline? Or are we really going to take this opportunity to use this as transforming the human resources that do the speeds and feeds and the gear turning to business and more business oriented types of tasks? Do you see any kind of, do you see which way the wind would blow in which way? And do you think that's possible to take these folks and gain value outside of the technical expertise that they have? And is that going to be the end game, or are we just trying to automate down to where humans are only just checking, final tallies, so to speak?
I think I agree with Mark's perspective, which is that this is a spectrum. You shouldn't think of DevOps versus NoOps as a conflict where one kind of wins over the other. I think across the spectrum, you've got a situation where there are a vast majority of applications that don't need to control and manage their infrastructure, because you focus on your application and get it deployed, and there's a standard platform that allows you to go do that. However, at the other end of the spectrum, there are going to be a number of different application providers who will need to control it, like the Amazons of the world, the Netflix of the world, the Apples of the world, where their scale and setup is just so vast that you are going to have to manage the underlying hardware and the infrastructure and the mechanisms of scaling, and you need an operations team that will manage that scale of deployment. So I think there is a big spectrum where there is space for DevOps to exist, and there is a niche. There is a specific area where that makes a lot of sense. But for a vast majority of application developers, you really shouldn't need to worry about all of those things. Like trying to figure out how you're going to scale to petabyte scale when you may be dealing with terabytes of data. Like you don't want to make decisions or over-architect your product and your decisions and your infrastructure at a point where you don't need to. At a time that you need to, you should, you should probably grow into DevOps or, start making that a priority when that becomes a business priority for you. Like for the likes of Amazon and Netflix, managing their hardware, managing their infrastructure growth is a business priority, right? But for most application software, managing infrastructure doesn't necessarily need to be a business priority.
It's interesting. So you see the move from DevOps to NoOps as kind of evolutionary change when an organization is more ready to go to that type of architecture? Is that?
It's kind of the reverse, where I think for most applications, you should try to do NoOps, where as you're growing, let's say you were a startup and you're growing into a larger organization, till you really need to go manage your infrastructure, you should look for NoOps solutions that are out there. And at some point, you might actually need to manage all of your infrastructure, where you need a separate DevOps team that you need to attach to your development team or make it an extension of your development team that starts managing how all your applications get deployed. So I think it's kind of, we've got this DevOps mechanism that's this big behemoth that involves a lot of, decision making, a lot of best practices to be, put into place. You need expertise that doesn't really exist. Like it's incredibly hard to go and hire amazing SREs and DevOps specialists that are really experienced in this kind of, infrastructure management. So if you can avoid it, I'd say avoid it. But at some scale, it's going to be imminent that you're going to need to manage all of that yourself. And
But I still believe that about for 80% of application developers today, you probably don't need it. And therefore, you should probably start looking at something like NoOps, or look for tools that enable NoOps, which make a lot of decisions for you. I'll give you an example of something like Google App Engine, right? Is one that's easy. We've got a product, we've got a solution called Engineered, which does the same thing, where you focus on your code, you get it deployed, it makes a bunch of decisions for you. It gives you a cradle in which you just plop in your code, and all the best practices for management and monitoring are built in for you, and you don't need to manage. Now, if you were dealing with 10,000 servers that need, like your application need to scale up and down from 0 to 10,000 servers, great. Then you probably need a DevOps team to handle a bunch of other scenarios that are going to creep up for that kind of scale. But for a vast majority of applications, you probably don't need it. So I'd say start with NoOps. And if you feel like you have grown to a point where you really need DevOps to manage scale, then go invest in a DevOps team. But that's hard. That's been one of the shortcomings of everyone trying to build DevOps teams. It's incredibly hard to go do and get it right.
I think Raul makes a good point, is don't try to build a lot of DevOps infrastructure that you think you're going to need in the future. Build what you need now. Start with NoOps and build the components that you need now. One of the things that I do with my clients a lot is try to manage down their expectations for complexity. They don't need to build a lot of complexity. And so we'll talk about, I have a chart that talks about most of your systems are serving, a typical size organization, is probably a couple of thousand people up to 100,000 people. And if you're building internal business systems for that scale, what you've got out of a standard Spring Boot toolkit or the .NET Core toolkit will scale to that without you having to think about any of these problems that you hear the Google engineers or the AWS engineers solving. Particularly if you're, we deal with organizations that have a regional footprint. So you don't have network transmission problems in that scale. Those are really interesting problems when you're worried about how long does it take to send data, from here to the UK. But if you have to send it from here to the next town over, that you don't need to solve that problem. It's electricity does the job for you, and your network cables do that problem for you. So don't try to solve problems prematurely, and start out with as minimal infrastructure as you need. And that's one of the reasons that I think AWS became so popular, was that you could start out a company and not have to go deal with the agony of setting up servers in a co-location facility, or worry about the servers that you've got running in your garage and are they going to survive, an 80-degree day. You don't have to worry about that. You can go incrementally buy a small amount of compute and build your prototype and go from there, and then manage that infrastructure yourself. And so you are building a completely empowered team. Now, if you're an existing organization, you've got a bunch of legacy applications. How do you free up a team to go do something like that? There, you're trying to evolve down a lot of, your organization has experienced pain over the years. And so you've put in some checks and balances and processes, and that you've got to go ask for permission to go do everything. How do you ratchet that down to make teams, the development teams themselves, responsible and able to make those choices for themselves, and give them the feedback when things are going to go wrong? Some of the systems that I've built, we noticed that we had certain kinds of bugs that recurred, and we were able to slowly over time go, okay, we know that when these conditions happen today, tomorrow we've got a bug that's going to affect a customer. So let's fix this problem today, and then go further upstream and go, okay, the day before we saw this was happening. So if we can stop it here, then we don't have to do this pain and agony on day -1, and the client's never affected. And then, oh, by the way, the reason that this is happening is because there's an upstream feed, and we've now got to go negotiate with that team to improve the way the data is coming to us, right? So we're able to recognize where the pain is coming from, and it falls to us to solve those problems ourselves. And that's kind of the point that I think that when you had traditional operations teams, the operations teams kind of felt the pain for when customer was impacted, and then they had to push it back to the development teams. DevOps was about development teams taking over that pain themselves, and NoOps is about giving the development teams the responsibility and empower them to make those choices themselves, so that they understand what their environment looks like, so they can make the changes that support the reliability and the business value that they're trying to get to.
Yeah, so I know, Rahul, you talked about a reverse evolution of some, in terms of the enabling technology, but, from a human perspective, it still seems like a straight line, right? Our traditional ops teams, were encumbered by having to engage a totally separate and distinct development team. And DevOps kind of brought them both together a little bit better. And now with NoOps, the dev team is essentially the leader of the pack and really the determinant moving forward from both a business and a technical side. Does that sound about reasonable? Yeah.
I think that is true that most teams that have tried to go implement DevOps, I think have struggled with it. And when you struggle with an execution, you try to simplify your decision making to a point where it starts working again for you. And I think that's kind of how NoOps has evolved. I wouldn't say it's a reverse evolution. It's basically everyone's been trying to get DevOps to work, because that would be an ideal scenario for scale. But as you realize that it's getting harder and harder to go execute that well, you kind of step back to simpler decisions that you start making to get it to work right. And there's one other dimension that I'll add to what Mark was just saying about services like AWS. I completely agree that when they started out, it actually liberated most dev teams because they could just go and then start doing a bunch of interesting stuff. But I still come back to the problem of choice now. If you look at AWS today, if you had to do simple logging, monitoring, and traceability or observability, you are making a choice between, hey, should I put in an ELK stack? Should I have CloudWatch logs? Where should my logs go? Should I deploy Prometheus? Should I deploy Grafana? Should I put stuff in X-Ray? There are just so many choices to go make that for most teams that aren't experts at making those choices, because if you go and ask AWS, they'll say you could use this or you could use that. They're trying to build everything for everybody today. So they will have no opinion about exactly what you should go use. And therefore, it becomes really hard for dev teams or DevOps teams to, number one, be experts at so many different services. Like AWS is launching hundreds of services every year. To ramp up on 100 of them every year and be on top of it, it's incredibly hard. So that's where I think most dev teams, as they try to simplify the decision-making framework, it's just too hard to keep track of everything. They say, okay, we need this. Is there a service out there that we can just go leverage that'll solve the problem for us now? When we get to scale, we'll go figure out what the right answer for that scale might be.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about tools, right? I mean, sometimes too much choice can be detrimental. And I know you talked about a number of tools that have kind of been either the precursor or current drivers behind NoOps, like Engine Yard, Google App Engine. Mark, you mentioned Spring Boot. Do you see any other ones that are truly game changing from a NoOps perspective? I think most of us understand a lot of the CI/CD tools that are out in the market, both open source and commercially available. I'm interested to see if you guys have seen any tools that say, you know what, this is going to be, from a technical perspective, like the ignition point to getting NoOps into the vernacular.
I think that from an evolution point of view, I don't think there's any one single tool that provides that for you. I think it's the focus on things like observability and making. So I see that the tools around observability to be the things that are game changers. So the Cloud Native Computing Foundation has a track on the open telemetry standard. And I think the tools that congregate around open telemetry are the kinds of tools that give teams the visibility to understand what's going on with their systems. So, in there's the open source tools like Prometheus and Grafana, and several of the tracing applications, which I'm drawing a blank on. But then you've got the vendors that are also providing stuff in that same realm. Dynatrace is one such tool. Datadog is providing other, and all of these are working to provide you a spectrum of tools to give you that deep understanding of what's going on in your code while it's running in production. And I think that's a useful environment to move to. In fact, I've got one client that is beginning to use Dynatrace in their test environment so they can have better understanding of what's going on while they're testing their code. And my recommendation is that you should deploy that to production as much as you want to deploy that into test, because production is where the rubber meets the road. That's where you want to be really observing what's going on in your system, both from a technical perspective and from a business value perspective. Figure out how you get that monitoring to work so you can use production and start doing test in production. And I horrified them by saying do test in production, but what I meant was that the testing that you're trying to, the errors that you're trying to correct in test, you're not seeing in your test environment, because they don't occur until you get to production scale. So the Dynatrace tool is a tool that many companies have used in production. So go ahead and do that. And Dynatrace doesn't have to be your only choice. Datadog and all of their competitors, or Prometheus and Grafana, can give you a lot of this same data. But you shouldn't be afraid of putting these observability tools into your production environment, because that's where the business value is actually created. So go do that, go experiment. And so the trick with NoOps, or the evolution to NoOps, is to empower development teams that they can make that decision, because they know there might be some short-term pain, but there will be long-term gains for reliability and for the business owners that own this system. So, I don't see that there's, any particular one tool that I would rely on. The automation tools that we've been doing automation for over a decade now, deployment automation for over a decade. And I think that we've got that under our belt, and it's really, last year at this time, Jez Body was at the Continuous Delivery Conference here in Seattle. And he said, when I talked about continuous delivery, it was basically two steps: continuous integration, continually build your code, and continuously deploy your code. And if you make it more complicated than that, you're doing yourself a disservice. Build and deploy as rapidly as possible. And so I take that to heart. Those tools, I think we've got a lot under our belt, and it's not a question of which tool do you use. It's a question of how do we get that tool up and running today so that tomorrow we're more efficient.
Yeah, big fan of the CNCF. So I just posted a link for all our attendees. And just a reminder before I let Rahul answer that question, please feel free to put in any questions you have in the Q&A. We'll get started with that in approximately 8 minutes. Rahul, go ahead. Sorry.
Great. So I think there I have a slightly different view than Mark, which is when I look at something like CNCF or all the tools out there, my big problem is that I don't know what the right tool is. Like Mark, you just named, I think 12 or 13 different tools just for traceability and observability. And I don't know which one to go pick, and I can't be an expert on all 12 to 15 of those to go figure out what the right one for my application is really going to be. So for me, it's kind of another layer of abstraction where you go up one level and you say, what is a platform out there where literally if I could do a git push and it takes care of everything and deploys everything for me, and I don't care whether they're running Grafana, Prometheus, whatever, the platform where I deploy has logging, monitoring, traceability, and tells me what's happening with my deployment, and it allows me to scale up and down depending on the load that kind of comes in. That for me is NoOps. That approach. So there are a few platforms that have kind of started up following that practice where they are making a lot of choices for you, where in an ideal world, they would just like you to do a git push. And like I said, App Engine, to some extent, when it started off, Elastic Beanstalk was kind of there, but they kind of deprioritized that. Engineered is another one that we've been building with the NoOps approach, where we don't want anybody to be able to be thinking about what is the underlying deployment mechanism, right? The platform should optimize stuff for you automatically, and all the best practices and best decisions brought into that platform for the use cases that match those constraints, and not leaving the complex decisions to the developers. So platforms like that for me are what are driving NoOps. There are tons of tools under the hood that are out there, and they're just growing, exponentially. Like if you looked at CNCF's projects over the last 5 years, they have grown exponentially, and it's almost impossible. Like I go visit that site once a month, And like, I can't wrap my head around all the different tools that are coming up in all the different stages of, maturity in CNCF. And it's just too hard to keep track. With that, all the services coming out of Amazon and Google and Azure, it's really, really hard to keep sense of everything that's going on. And then on top of that, all the best practices associated with each one of those services, which are all unique and bespoke in their own right, because everyone is trying to differentiate themselves from everyone else.
So, and I think this is where Raul and I kind of diverge a little bit from practicality. I think developers need to be involved in those decisions, and that if you've got a team of multiple teams of developers all developing different components that go to build your business value, those developers might have, the developers over here might have a different set of priorities and needs than developers over here. So if there's one opinionated CI/CD framework, it may be that those opinions are the opinions of these developers and don't account for the things that those developers want to do. So I've seen teams that have put together really large CI/CD pipelines that build thousands of builds a day. But the problem is that it works for maybe 50% of the teams really well, and another half of the teams are really struggling in there. So those developers that are building, Java-based system, it works great. But those people that are doing Android development, that CI/CD pipeline doesn't work and doesn't support their need for the mobile applications that they're building, or worse, for the iOS applications that are following on. Or you've got I've got a customer that does gaming, and so their build process and their test process needs to involve a bunch of GPUs during the build cycle. The mainstream build server has no GPUs available to it, so that centralized CI/CD platform that takes all the makes all those choices for those developers and takes them away from that doesn't give them the flexibility to meet their business needs. So, and I know, so that's in many respects, that's why I see giving teams the choice to build their own pipeline. Although, yes, you can get stuck with, there are so many tools to choose from. How do you choose? And it's really just, in many cases, it's just pick one. You have lots of feature parity across the different systems. So pick any one. Pick the one with the logo that makes you smile. Pick that one, because pretty much in the DevOps space, you're going to find that a lot of these tools are going to give you almost all of the same features and benefits. So you're not going to go wrong with the tool, with any particular tool.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we've got my next question was actually asked by somebody from the audience, so I'm going to post it up here for everybody. And we've kind of touched on it in certain areas, both in tool sets, and readiness, but I'm sure there's still a little bit more we can explore from that. The question is, can organizations with a weak or non-existent DevOps initiative or with no DevOps initiative make the jump directly to a NoOps model?
I think that they can, and Raul, I'll let you speak a little bit. But when there are, I think that teams can just go forward and start, in this case, take sort of a cowboy approach, and that you're going to end up owning any mistakes that you make, but own those mistakes and go forth and choose what you need to and deploy in your environment. And I have done that a number of times in my career, and I've seen teams that have successfully done that overall. Early on in my career, I worked with a defense contractor on an RFP for the government, and the interesting thing was, while the defense contractor itself that I'd worked with them in the past, they were slow and lumbering, and I never thought they'd have a chance. There was one small team inside this defense contractor that was really, they got it and they could move fast, and they really didn't ask for permission. And so, be one of those teams, understand that you're going to own your mistakes. So make good decisions, go get advice, but then move forward and go do it. And I think you can do that, particularly where there's organizations that are struggling in their operations teams. Politics aside, you've got to deal with the politics, but think about the human factors and move forward in a way that makes your team comfortable with the tools they're deploying and the business value that they're delivering, because they feel they can deliver it reliably and comfortably. Raul, how would you approach that?
Yeah, so very similar to what you said, which is if you're starting off without a DevOps team, and I'd say go find a platform that makes most of the decisions for you, that gives you things out of the box, and start using it first. And
Yeah.
I'd say there's a greater than 50% chance that it'll work for you. There's probably a greater than 80% chance that it'll work for you, because if you're managing today without NoOps, if you're a startup, if you're getting started, if you're a mid-sized organization that doesn't have a DevOps team, those are typically scenarios where you don't need to make bespoke decisions for your product. You probably could do with a standard platform that makes a lot of the best practices decisions for you and gives you a lot of the benefits right out of the box. Okay, it may not give you that level of crazy customization that you might want, but the defaults will all work for most of you. So I'd say, yes, get started with that. And when you get to a point where you need those bespoke controls, where it starts affecting the impact, or it starts affecting your business requirements, then go, evolve into DevOps, or trying to build out a DevOps team where you then start needing to make bespoke decisions about your infrastructure and your architecture. So if you don't need to, don't waste your time and energy doing that. Just leverage a platform that does most of that heavy lifting for you.
And do not be afraid of SaaS. You don't have to deploy this stuff on premise. Do not be afraid of SaaS. And those SaaS tools, they'll have sort of an opinion way. Find a SaaS tool that most of those opinions seem to match yours, and go forth. And don't worry about it. Start building the business value that you want to build.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the SaaS tools are more, I think they're more in line with a lot of these newer development models that we're talking about anyway. So I think they mesh perfectly. I'm going to take the next question myself and then give it to everybody else, being the CISO also at the Dana Foundation. The next question is, how do you see security fitting in with a movement towards NoOps? And to me, I see we've been trying to, quote unquote, shift left, not only from a development perspective, but also from an app dev security perspective. So it's just a continuation of that model where we're trying to get more and more of these vulnerabilities, these threats, the modeling around this stuff done earlier in the development cycle as possible. So we check a lot of these code-based vulnerabilities quicker. And then so that the final product has less of an attack surface out there. That's my main concern, whenever I'm determining risk and the appropriate controls to mitigate that risk as a result of development and app dev. Do either one of you have any additions to that?
So I totally agree that you can leverage a lot of tools and you want to shift left on security. So what I see as the evolution is as you move through DevOps into a NoOps environment, development teams don't have to be responsible for all of the decisions that they need to make. They can go use consultants. And this is where what used to be your operations team before morphs into more of an SRE team. They're very knowledgeable about the hardware and the network feeds and how things connect together. They become more consultative to the development teams, and same way with the security organization. So the security organization becomes less of a thou shalt do this to more of a consulting organization that says, let us help you run an attack model and a tabletop exercise on an attack on your system. And let's see where things can fall apart and how you can mitigate them. And so you become much more, the team gets probably smaller, but they get greater expertise and they become much more a consultative role. And so it's up to the NoOps teams to take advantage of this expertise that still lives in their organization. So the operations team has a lot of tribal knowledge and useful knowledge about engineering aspects. Take advantage of that. The security team has been trained in the things that you talk about. Most developers are not comfortable with things like attack surface and threat models and that sort of thing. So go use your security team as consultants and get them to guide you to the right answer. And then once you know what the right answer is, go implement that.
I'll add one quick thing to that, which is back to the concept of NoOps, go find a platform that does most of the security heavy lifting for you and gives you those guardrails right out of the box for you, because at the end of the day, it boils down to the level of complexity that your business can afford. And the more choices you have to make, the more bespoke things you go create, you basically expose that much more, surface for attack, because you've got to be specialists in that. For every decision that is bespoke that you make, you've basically exposed another, part of the surface of your application for attack, and you've got to be experts at it to prevent those kind of attacks. So if you find a platform where there are specialists who have constructed this black box approach, or an environment or a platform that gives you guardrails that prevents you, like there's some, like Engineer, for example, will not allow you to go deploy any service that is not HTTPS. And by saying this has got to be HTTPS only, you're not opening up 23 different ports, allowing attackers to come in and hit it. It's all HTTPS only. So then you've got WAF kind of built into the platform. So you at least make sure that you're able to blacklist any incoming requests or sources of requests that are basically attacking, that seems like an attack, and you've got a lot of AI models built into it. If I were to do that all by myself from scratch, that'd be incredibly hard to go do. So you have to basically judge what kind of complexity your business affords, and do you really want to handle that complexity? And it boils down to how many bespoke choices do you really want to make, and be aware of the fact that every bespoke choice comes with an increased attack surface that you've got to be a specialist at.
Well, yeah, there's a couple things here, right? So one, I would say that, in terms of complexity, it only should be introduced when the risk of not introducing that is too high, both to the business and to your development cycle. The other is you're constantly fighting, from a development and a business side, right? The developer really is under pressure to get the product out, not necessarily to make sure it's 100% secure and will reduce the amount of risk down to an acceptable level. So whenever you get that friction, you're going to have these kinds of things. And Rahul, I wish I could find that tool that handles most of the vulnerabilities, but you mentioned a few. But having seen most of the DevSecOps tools providers or rugged DevOps providers, there's still a long way to go in those areas. So, all right.
I think it's definitely evolving.
Yeah,
for sure.
Agreed.
Nothing is 100% there, but it's definitely evolving. And consolidating on one of these platforms allows that knowledge to come in, right? Like, I think this goes back to another question that's kind of in here somewhere, where I don't think that I would ever want to now manage my own data center, because just managing security of a data center alone is such a nightmare. I would just go with Amazon, and they have more security experts working on the security issues than anyone else on the planet, right? So why would I want to invest in a security team trying to figure out how to manage my own data center? It just feels like a level of complexity that my business at least doesn't want to afford.
Well, that was a counter argument for going to the cloud in general, right? They were saying, well, isn't it too risky to move from our traditional legacy on-prem to the cloud? And when you can counter that argument with what you just said, right? Who has more security experts, me or Microsoft, me or Amazon?
Correct.
It's right in line with that. Mark, did you want to add anything there?
Well, I think this leads into the question in the chat around how do you bundle in SOX? If you've got SOX controls, if you've got a heavy compliance need in your organization, how do you do that? And the way that I've done that in the past is to build those SOX control into our DevOps process. So I worked for an aircraft manufacturer on non-airborne software, but it still has an annual review process that's got to get done. And every change has got to be approved by the business. So if you're making changes multiple times a week, how do you get that business approval? You build that into your process. So what we did was we set up our Kanban tool. We spent a lot of time talking to our business partners to make sure they're aware of every change that we made. And in the tool, the business partners would use that tool to approve changes by moving them from one column to the other. So every change that we made, we had a business partner involved in that. And then at the end of the year, for that, what used to be a laborious 2-week process of reviewing every change request and checking for proper authorization and sign off, turned out to be a report that was run out of our DevOps tool that showed that every state transition into deployment ready was done by a business person, not by a technical person. So we had sign off on everything, and we had a report generated. We had controls around the data that allowed us to make sure that there was business sign off. So what you do is you build those controls into your process at the lowest level possible. And the other thing I think about SOX is to recognize that it's about who can change the data. It's not about who's got visibility to it. One of the corporations that I worked for decided that in order to meet SOX controls, they were cutting off all developer access to all production systems. And besides the outcry that happened at the development organization, their operations team went absolutely nuts. So the number of errors that they couldn't fix doubled overnight. And at the end of the week, their ticket queues and everything were completely out of whack. So what SOX says is that you have to have a process to make sure the data is correct. And the people who know how to keep that data correct are the developers. And you have to trust them to do the right thing. Trust but verify. That's why reconciliation is a huge piece of what you do. Build that into your daily or hourly processes at the lowest level of granularity that you can. And these problems get to be solvable. They become just the background noise. They become the dial tone of operating. And I think SOX should be, compliance controls should be the dial tone of how you operate your business. But make it the dial tone. Don't make it something that happens on an irregular basis or something that's very painful.
Yeah, sounds like that organization needs to read the Phoenix Project in their spare time.
I add one other thing to this, to exactly what Mark said, which is that you can also layer in your compliance in the sense that your application deployment is typically multiple layers. And if you can offload a bunch of compliances, especially at the lower layers, to other parties or platforms that actually do that for you, you should do it. So for example, if you were using a NoOps platform, I'll give you an example of Engineard because that's what I'm most familiar with. Engineard is basically built on AWS. Okay, so at the lowest level, AWS has its SOX compliance that tells you about all the underlying functions that the infrastructure is compliant with. Then on top of that, Engineard has its SOX compliance, which tells you with all the other guardrails and all the other decisions made, how SOX compliance just comes right out of the box. You've got those reports. And then you only really need to worry about how your code and the logic in your code is SOX compliant. So that way your audit requirements come down dramatically, and your audit requirement just relies on Engineard's SOX compliance, which then relies on AWS's SOX compliance as well. So you can build up your compliance in terms of layers, which is what most of our customers really do. And it keeps their audit requirements also to a minimal, where they only focus on their code, not the entire infrastructure stack end to end.
Yeah, I think to reiterate what Raul said, you're using AWS to make that compliance part of your infrastructure dial tone. You're using Engineard to make that part of your infrastructure, SOX is part of your infrastructure dial tone. That's correct.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. And Mark, since it was posted to you, maybe you should lead off to it. It's in the chat. ITSM, DevOps, NoOps spectrum, where's the pain of the client shouldered if DevOps from ITSM move from ops to development?
So I think that when you're using a pure ITSM process and you've got, operations in level 1 and level 2 teams, all of those client requests and that client pain falls to your, it starts with that level in your organization, the people that are not really equipped to do the deep investigative problem set for these problems. So I see that DevOps addresses this because it moves those alerts and those pages and the other sorts of questions and answers that are affecting your clients directly to the development team. It's the development team that's going to end up producing the fix. They, when they deployed code that had the problem in it. It's their job to get it. So what you really want to do is to funnel the pain to the person that caused it. And so the way to do that is to get those pages and everything to go to the development team. And so I think one of the clear indicators that you're in a NoOps environment is that the dev teams are carrying pagers, and the dev teams respond to basically all of the client requests that come in. You know, if a disk is out of space, that goes to the dev team. If operations are failing, if clients aren't able to log into the system, that goes to the dev team, and not to an operations team. And so it's up to the development team to deploy software that mitigates these problems before they happen.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, where you put the responsibility, not only the empowerment, but also the accountability as well.
Exactly.
So no question about it. And Rahul, I see you're typing an answer to that one long question in Q&A. I didn't want to read that off live, and thank you so much. With that, I don't know if you have an answer that you can post up there for the benefit of our folks, but we're going to wrap up in just about now. We're coming to the end of the hour. So I think we're all set. Any final comments?
James, thank you for having me. Again, I think that NoOps is the true north of where you're headed with DevOps and with moving away from ITSM.
Excellent. Mark, thanks for joining up. Rahul, thank you so much as always. Great insight on any one of these story topics. And Max, I think it's time to hand it back to you.
Awesome. Amazing stuff, guys. Thank you so much for that. It's really fascinating to hear your perspectives. I know you guys are super busy, so we do really appreciate you taking the time to share your insight. Before we end, I just want to mention that we did record the session, so we'll make that recording available for you guys tomorrow. So look out for an email, and then you can reshare that content or rewatch it if you'd like. And yeah, big thank you to DevGraph for making this possible. If you haven't, go and check them out. And thank you guys for tuning in as well. So yeah, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Take care, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys.
Thank you.